The Anatomy of Self-Sabotage. That was that's the topic. I know I'm smiling, but it's really not a laughing matter. I once met someone who came to see me about certain issues, challenges they had, and I asked them, we're going through different usual suspects of the issues or problems people have, and I asked the person if he has any blind spots, and his answer was yes, but don't worry, he said, I know where they are. Now, the definition of a blind spot is that you don't know where they are. That's why it's called a blind spot. Because if you knew where they are, then you can do something about it. So you may know, for example, in the car there's the blind spot where the rear view mirror can't quite pick up a particular section to the right back of your car. So since you know that there's that blind spot, you do something to compensate for it by either looking over your shoulder. So I guess that's what he meant. But my impression was that it was really about not about being able to identify that he really thought that since I know what my blind spots are, I'm not blind to them. And that's not correct. In 2002, Donald Rumsfeld created a whole uproar commentary when he was being questioned, interrogated about the Iraq War, Persian Gulf War. And he said then at the time that there are things we know. There are things we know that we don't know. And then there's, in other words, the known, the knowable unknown, the unknown which we know is unknown. And then there's what we don't know, the unknown unknown. And obviously the third category is the one that creates most problems because you have no idea what you don't know. And in the defense and other areas, that's the most important area because any surprise could happen because you don't even know. It's one thing you know that you don't know something, so you keep an eye out on it. What happens if you don't even know that you don't know? You don't know what areas even to look at. So when someone says, don't worry, I know what my blind spots are, that begins to be the first reason to worry, be concerned. Because that means they're not acknowledging their own subjectivity and their own inability sometimes to see clearly, and therefore you can end up becoming part of the problem. This is especially true in relationships, an emotional area, where people can be convinced that they're right, and when you say to them, are you sure that you have it all figured out? And they say, absolutely. The problem is my spouse. The problem is this one. The problem is that one. The problem is this. The problem is that. And when you challenge this person and say, 1 second, how are you so sure? Maybe you're part of the problem. No, they're convinced. Once a person takes that stance and that attitude, it's almost impossible to do anything about that. Because then you're dealing with a situation where there's no one to talk to. They're convinced that they're not the issue. So that's the topic we're going to be addressing. What do you do about that? And basically, essentially, we can become our own worst enemy, whether you call it self-destructive behavior or self-sabotage or other terms, but essentially our own subjectivity gets in the way and thus does not allow us to really solve a problem. Because it's one thing if it's true that someone else is the problem or something else is the problem. So then you identify that someone or that something, you identify the problem, and you do something to remedy it. But if you indeed are part of the problem and don't even recognize or acknowledge it, what recourse do we have? Because every second you're just feeding the problem. As we say many times, the awareness of an issue is half its cure. If you're not aware of what we call denial, then where do you go from there? So the most important thing, before we even get into the details of the anatomy of it all, is to recognize that in any given situation, you may have blind spots that you're not aware of. Yes, you may have blind spots that you are aware of. Some people, for example, say, I know when it comes to, let's say, my children, I'm emotionally subjective, and I don't know how to say no. So it's a type of like a weakness. So we can call that the known unknowns. You know that you're weak there. But what about the areas, as I was saying, that we have no clue that we don't even know. So if a person is not ready to approach it with some type of acknowledgement that that's possible, many, many, many problems become far bigger and far greater than they had to become. So think of it this way. Imagine how many problems would be avoided or solved if we were able to look at ourselves and people be able to look at themselves and see that indeed there may be something I don't know that I don't know. Because then that's the beginning of the cure, because you're ready at least to acknowledge that. That's what we wanted to discuss. So everybody understands that people are subjective. That is a given. It comes with a turf. Every one of us is born with subjective interests. And the Hebrew term for it is negei b'davar, which means you're biased. There's a self-bias, a self-prejudice about issues. That in general, you'll give yourself the benefit of the doubt, and you won't give someone else the same benefit of the doubt. You'll be much lighter on yourself and much more lenient on yourself than you'll be with others. I should qualify, there are people who are far harsher on themselves than others. That's also a problem. But we're talking in a more common sense, because there's a thing called survival, and we protect self-protective survival. So if any issue comes up, in a good way, we need to be able to protect ourselves. That's the way God wired us, that when you're in a dangerous situation or something happens, you always are making sure that your needs are being taken care of. That's fine. Where does it become a problem? When that spills over, as I said, to a subjective self-interest that doesn't allow you to see the problem or see that you may be part of that problem. So in analyzing this, the real question is, what is the root of this self-interest? And what is the root of our ability to, and our capacity to be so blind to the point that we can be self-destructive? Now, basic psychology would dictate and state that most people's self-destructive behavior is a result of one of the following causes. One, it could be that when we have been invalidated, especially in our childhood, and we don't have the security and comfort of just being accepted who we are, so we are constantly bending over backwards to protect our turf and to protect ourselves, to the point that we find it invalidating and finding annihilating if we were to be wrong. So some people simply feel they can't be wrong. And what they're really doing is trying to protect themselves, and often it comes from a deep insecurity. So that idea that someone says you have a blind spot or something is the matter with you, that becomes very, very threatening, because essentially it's challenging our perception. As I said, someone who's extremely insecure will have that issue, because the insecurity, a outgrowth of that, is the need to always feel that I need to be secure. And that includes an exaggerated sense of self-righteousness, an exaggerated sense of seeing it my way, and an inflexibility and an inability to be able to recognize or see that there may be something you're not seeing. Because for that person, it challenges, as I said, their very being. Whereas a secure person can say, you know what, I'm secure. If you point out that I made a mistake, or you point out I have a blind spot, I will not become annihilated. I won't disappear as a result. I won't be judged by it, and I won't see myself as less because I have a blind spot. That a secure person would say that. An insecure person would never say that, because an insecure person right away is threatened, as if you're taking away their right to be able to choose or their right to be able to be correct. So often you can explain this adamance that people say, I'm absolutely right, and the problem is with someone else, is really just a very fundamental insecurity, that they just cannot look at something and see that maybe they are part of the issue or the problem. That's one way. Another way is mimicking behavior. If you saw your parents and the adults that shaped you in your formative years, that they were always right, a father, for example, that could not be wrong, he's always right. And as a child, you sometimes saw your father was not right, but you constantly saw that he insisted that everybody say he's right, or a mother for that matter, then you mimic that, and you feel that's the way to be. The way to be is that you do not have blind spots. And if someone challenged your father and said, maybe you got it wrong, and he becomes very adamant and says no, as a child you start mimicking that, even though it's unhealthy, but that becomes your model. So your model becomes one of lack of acknowledgement that I may have an issue. And this can be very profound. As I said, it's one thing, and I should maybe elaborate on this, even though I mentioned it, but I want to elaborate. It's one thing to know you have a blind spot, like I said, with the rear view mirror in a car. And that means it's like knowing this is a sensitive area. Like many of us will go to a lawyer or an advisor or a consultant in a given area because we know I have a blind spot here. Since I have a blind spot and I have self-interest, I go to an advisor and say, this is my situation, can you give me advice? That is a very healthy approach. Why? Because you recognize you may have a blind spot. You recognize you may not be able to fully see the picture clearly. So you want someone to give you a second opinion, whatever the circumstance may be. That's knowing, as I said, the unknown. Knowing that there's something unknown, and you're going now to try to achieve clarity. But the problem becomes far more greater, as I said earlier, when you have no clue that you don't know. You may be proceeding and think everything is fine. Imagine someone driving that car, looks in the rearview mirror, and they think they have the entire periphery vision, and sees everything. And they decide to move to the right lane, and God forbid, there's a car right there, because of the blind spot they didn't see the car, there could be a major accident, God forbid. Why? Because they didn't recognize that there's that blind spot. They didn't know that there's an unknown. It's an unknown. So if we apply that to other areas in our lives, we all have stuff like that, where you can be convinced, I have it figured out. Either, as I said, either because you've allowed yourself to convince yourself and have never been challenged, which is yet another factor that often causes us also. That's a third reason. So I gave so far 2 reasons. Here's a third reason why someone may be in that situation where they are blind to their blind spots. And that is, I said, the first reason I said was insecurity. The second is mimicking adult behavior that has shaped you. And the third is a completely different reason, and that is that you've been spoiled. No one's ever challenged you. There are kids that are spoiled, that they think they're always right. They always have that sense of entitlement, and no one's ever challenged them, so they become convinced as they grow into adults, which of course is one of the great disservices of parents who always make their children feel that they're right. There's nothing wrong with feeding confidence of your children and feeding their security. That's absolutely healthy. But if your child makes a mistake, you want to also tell them this was a mistake. Because you don't want them to be deluded into thinking as they grow older that whatever they do is perfect. There are people like that, a sense of deep entitlement where they can do no wrong. It's probably connected somewhat to the first and second reasons as well, but it's another factor that should be added in the picture. So we have here these different factors that come to a point where we literally are in a situation where we cannot see what we cannot see. You can say that the Baal Shem Tov's terms, the Baal Shem Tov's words, on the verse Aster Ponai, where he says, God says in a double concealment, I have covered and uncovered my face. So he explains that there's 2 types of coverings. One is a darkness, a covering where you know it's dark. And when it's dark, you know it's dark outside. So therefore you either shine a light or you just avoid looking for things because it's dark. But what happens if the darkness conceals the fact that it's dark? What happens if the darkness conceals the fact that it's dark? You don't even know it's dark. You can convince yourself it's light. And you convince yourself everything is clear. When in fact it's such a darkness you don't even know it. That would be the unknown unknowns. And that, of course, is a far more complicated one because you don't even have that awareness. So the first step is to recognize that you can never, ever be sure about things. And in case you're so convinced, always check with an objective party. Do you mind just move that box? Just get rid of it. Yeah. Actually, you know something? Fine. Sorry about that. So in the anatomy, I've given so far 3 reasons. But if you go deeper, and this is a theme that I have a recurrent theme that's discussed many times, especially based on the Kabbalistic concept from the Arizal, the doctrine of the Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum is a concealment, where he explained the utter concealment, what he calls the initial Tzimtzum, the primordial Tzimtzum, which is the primordial concealment with the divine presence and the divine reality, concealed itself in order to allow for independent consciousness like ours to arise, to emerge. And that is really the root of all concealments. Had that not existed, what is the Eitz Chaim? The Eitz Chaim is the classic work of Rabbi Chaim Vital, where he documents this doctrine and many others. He puts it this way: with the tzimtzum, not but with the so-called pre-tzimtzum, conceptually pre. What was the consciousness like? He says the divine energy filled everything. Now, everything, of course, is just a metaphorical term, because there was no everything. It just means whatever would be, anything that would become existent, it filled. I'll think of it this way: imagine truth. The truth filled all of reality. We would have no court cases. We would have no lies. We'd have no deception. We would have no duplicity, because truth would be there. You know, you sometimes think about it, a court case spends millions, if not who knows how many dollars, just to see if a person has lied. People were just telling the truth and everybody was honest, we wouldn't have the whole legal system. We wouldn't need a legal system. But we live in a world where truth can be concealed. Something that happens, you can deny it. You could say it never happened. You may have been a criminal and done something, you could say it never happened. So the Kabbalists are very disturbed by that concept. How is that possible? How could there be such an untruthful world, an alma de shikra, especially one created by God, the ultimate, the absolute, and epitome of truth? And the answer is because the truth concealed itself and allowed room, for those that want to make a mistake, they can make a mistake. Those that want to lie, they can lie. There's a duplicity. It's only possible because there's a concealment. There's actually a very fascinating statement that says that when Mashiach comes, the Messianic age, Even Mekir Tizak, the stone from the wall will cry out. The stone from the wall will cry out and tell us and bear witness of what it's seen. Now, you could that sounds like miraculous, but today it's not so miraculous. If you look at, for example, how cameras are now being placed almost everywhere on Earth, you literally are coming to an age where literally everything can be seen and heard through technology. So it may not be the stone on the wall, but it's definitely a physical camera or a microphone that everything can testify that there will be a point where you'll not be able to get away with a crime with someone recording it. And I know that's terrifying for many people because they live secret lives or duplicitous lives or double lives. But that is not a very distant future. It's already happening. Today something happens on the street, most likely there's a camera that picked it up. And these cameras are multiplying more and more and more. There are probably places where there isn't an inch that's not covered. So is that not a form of the stones of the walls cry out? Okay, you could say it's not a physical stone, it's not a physical wall, but it's still a physical object. It's a physical technology made up of digital parts and other components that allow that capacity. Where once upon a time, time and space were very separate from one another. And if there was a wall that separated, you can do something on the other side of the wall, no one will see you. That's no longer the case. I actually just read about a new technology that doesn't even need a camera. It picks up, almost like an X-ray, it can pick up the waves. Just like cell phones, for example, have the cellular waves that are bouncing around. Imagine a machine that can pick up, through like the ultrasound, can pick up objects through shooting audio waves. So you don't even need a camera. Through audio waves, you can actually see the images of something moving about in a house or in a store or whatever it may be. So if you think of all the technologies and all the different, whether it's X-rays or it's infrared or others, today it is not, it is quite conceivable that verse will be a reality a real reality in our lives. What's my point? My point is that is a world where the truth is obvious. But as we are right now, we can hide a truth. We can say one thing and mean another. We can do something and then deny it. We can live with our secrets, because that's the world in which we live, a duality, where what you see is not what you get, and there's a separation, there's a concealment. That is the root of it all, the concealment. Now, the concealment can be, as I said, a concealment where you know that you're lying. Like there are people who know, I'm not telling the truth. But you know when it really gets tragic? When you don't even know you're lying anymore. And some people become such compulsive liars and so comfortable with lying, some serial liars, that they don't even know what's a lie anymore. It became natural to them. And as we all know, when it comes to lies, once the lie becomes, one lie leads to another lie, and another lie, and your whole life, and your whole life story can be a lie. And it becomes so comfortable that you're not even guilty or feeling any way uncomfortable with the fact that you're saying an untruth. And that's when we enter in the world of the unknown unknowns, where suddenly we become somebody we're really not, and we're faking it or acting and projecting one thing when we're really feeling or seeing something else. There's even a point where you don't even know who you really are. Am I the one that is masquerading, or am I something else? And this happens especially in situations, think of just an example, a very dysfunctional home, where there's almost a silent conspiracy that we cover up the abuse in the home, and we cover up the lies, where you become complicit in a really false reality. How many times have I heard from people, I lived a false life. I lived in a home where we were told we have to smile for the pictures. I was told I have to look happy, told to go to school and feel all good, when in truth is I was crying and tortured within. So you suddenly have two realities. You grow up thinking, projecting this type of outside show, when in truth inside you're miserable, you're hurt. And then there comes a point where the inside becomes so concealed, you don't even know who's who. I've heard this as well. Now obviously I'm using extreme examples, and in most cases we don't have such extremity, but these examples are real, but they show us on a moderate level that there is that capacity. That at some point, you have stories, I'm trying to think of ones that are very obvious, stories where people assumed another character, and after a while they don't want to give up that character, because that's who they became. They have now assumed another character, and they're very comfortable with it. So this is essentially the epitome of being self-sabotage, because you have now concealed the concealment. It's like you killed the witness, and no one ever will know that you're not that person anymore. Maybe it's a form of identity theft, and not necessarily in the legal or financial sense, but in the psychological sense, an identity crisis. And it's all as a result of the fact that concealment is a reality in our lives. And if that concealment becomes something you live off, then you become part of that problem, and you yourself become someone that becomes self-destructive. And then there's a situation where you really cannot even acknowledge that you have blind spots. You definitely cannot acknowledge that there's the unknown, that there may be things you have no idea that you don't even know. I mean, sometimes it's almost pathetic. You hear people speak about themselves, and you see right through them that they really are so transparent they don't even realize it. Either they're bragging, or they're projecting some type of bravado that they really are not. And to some people it's transparent, and it's sad to see that a person goes through those motions and they really think they're fooling somebody. Maybe they are fooling some people. And they like to hang around people they fool. And often they're not comfortable with someone that somewhat sees through them. So the point here is not obviously to make somebody uncomfortable or to insult or humiliate someone. It's just, my point is simply to make how far, to what extent we can carry this component of lying to ourselves, to the point you don't even know that you're lying to yourself, which is even worse than if you do know. Or, one could argue which is worse. Whether it's just delusional to the point you don't even realize that you are simply deluding yourself, or you do realize, and maybe those are the two levels of the darkness that I talked about, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. So how does it help us knowing the root of these issues? Following so far?
Amazing.
Good. So how does it help us to know the root? Well, the root of problems are always critical, because you could always, there's symptomatic medicine, there's remedial medicine where you address the symptoms. Person has blind spots. So let's say you help them start seeing clearly, but you may not get to the root of it, then you're just resolving the issue short term. Understanding the root helps us really understand ourselves, and in a way also defangs the enemy, because it's not about that we're necessarily bad people. We were thrust into a world that's a lying world. Remember that Tzimtzum is not man-made. It's divine. It's God-made. You know, it's not made in China, and it's not made in America, and it's not made in any other country. It's divine product. It's a divine product that was given to us as a reality that when we're born into this world, there will be an element of concealment. We will not see. Take, for example, Mark Twain has a great line. He says, the two most important moments in a person's life is the moment you're born and the moment you realize the purpose for which you were born. So the moment we were born, everybody can relate to. But the moment the purpose you were born, what is the purpose? When we come out of our mother's womb, we don't have a little box or a little packet that says, hey, this is your mission to fulfill the rest of your life. We're thrust into a world, even in the best of homes, and hopefully parents that nurture us and educate us and teach us and guide us and cultivate, to help cultivate our skills. Still, purpose is going to be an effort to find. And then when you go down the roads of life, and I don't mean the physical roads, I mean the figurative roads. And you go, do you go to the right? Do you go to the left? Do I choose this? Do I choose that? You may not know. You may go down the wrong road, make mistakes, and even come back and try the next road. Or you may end up in the mistake and never want to come back and then start wandering. Nobody gets lost in the woods overnight. You make one little, you veer off a little, and then you don't go back. What happens after a while? You're so far away. And sometimes people say, how did I lose my way? It didn't begin in a moment. It took time. So we live in a world that kol hadrachim b'cheskes sakana, the Talmud says. All the paths of our journey are filled with danger. When I say danger, it doesn't necessarily mean physical danger. It just means we do not know. Right now, you can make a choice. I'm going to do the following. I have two options. Do I go this way? Do I go that way? And you make a choice, and maybe a mistake. There's nothing wrong with that if you catch a mistake and you correct it. What's wrong is if you start becoming invested in your mistake and say, you know what? No, it's impossible. I didn't make a mistake. And start deluding yourself into thinking the mistake is the right way. You know, language of, what's the language in 1984? Not doublespeak, whatever. The language that they create. War is peace. Love is hate. And suddenly you convince yourself that that which is a complete mistake is the way of life, my path. So life is filled with these lurking dangers. And we enter a world which not by our choice is, the paths are concealed from us. What is your path toward happiness? Can someone tell you? I mean, imagine someone was able to guarantee your path to happiness. We all know, anyone that guarantees that, you know, is not a path to happiness. Because the path to happiness is filled with challenges and filled with doubts and filled with trial and error. So that is not that's not our doing. That's God put us in such a world. That's the tzimtzum. But what we do afterwards is the key. That's why it's so critical to know the root. Because once you know that, you'll say, okay, once I know that this world, just because something looks appealing, someone offers you a candy, you have to know, maybe it's not a candy, maybe it's poison. Someone offers you something very appealing, something seduces your senses, something seduces you, something is very tantalizing, very tempting. You have to know, once you know that there's a tzimtzum world, that there's a world of concealment, not everything that looks good is good. Not everything that looks right is right. So knowing that is the first way we counter the tzimtzum. So in a way, we're at war with the tzimtzum, the divine tzimtzum that God created. God concealed, and our job is to reveal. The worst thing possible is if you buy into the concealment and say, you know, it's not concealed, it really is beautiful, and look. And then start pursuing a life like that and convincing yourself that materialism is an end in itself. That's the first deception, that we think materialism is the biggest seducer. Materialism, I mean everything, whether it's money, power, fame, pleasure, hedonistic behavior, everything that gives you gratification. That's the first buying into the deception. What is the right way? The right way is to know that there are many things that tempt me, but these are but this is a life that's concealed. This may not be my path, and the healthy thing is to figure out what is my path. So you don't allow the tzimtzum to deceive you. And the first thing to know is that there is a concealment that's inherent in life. That's why it's so important to understand the anatomy of self-sabotage. It begins with recognizing there's a concealment. Now, it does not have to become self-sabotage if you understand that it's concealed. So one analogy given for this, a powerful analogy in Hasidic thought, is the parent that hides from the child in order for the child to elicit the child's ingenuity to find the parent. So the parent, being a very smart parent and wants to elicit the ingenuity, hides himself or herself conceals themselves in a very good hiding place. It's actually so good that the child cannot find the parent. It looks and looks and looks. The expression of the Rebbe once, Sunday it looks, and Monday it looks, and Tuesday, and Wednesday. It looks, and at some point, I can't find my parent. Now, there's two options that can happen here. The child can either continue looking, realize it's there somewhere, I just haven't found it yet, and I need to keep at it, or the child can give up. What does giving up means? Saying, you know what, maybe my parent isn't there after all. That's when we begin to enter the blind spots of recognizing, of not acknowledging that there's the unknown unknowns. Because if the child at least continues searching, it may take time, so at least I know there's something I don't know. And I'm seeking and searching and trying to find it. But if the child gives up, then it buys into the deception and gives it a lot more credibility than it really was, because then the parent, what happens? The parent never meant to hide. The parent simply meant the child should find the parent. So imagine how sad it is. A parent is hiding and the child is no longer looking. So the parent remains crying in that great hiding place, and the child no longer is looking. This is the equivalent of what it translates psychologically is when we are no longer, we convince ourselves that there's nothing secret, there's nothing hidden. I see everything. What I see is what I get. I don't see a parent, that means there's no parent. I don't see God. I don't see miracles. I don't see light. And I don't see direction. And then that can turn into a certain skepticism, which can in turn evolve into a cynicism and an apathy and an indifference to the point, you know what, my life is fine. Is it really fine? Not necessarily, but it's comfortable. And many people would rather choose a comfort zone than the truth. If you could be comfortable and it's not true, or you can be true and it's not comfortable, which one would most people choose? I know people would like to say, I would always choose the path of truth, but that's not necessarily the case. Because the fact of the matter is, comfort zones are very powerful. So now the comfort zone comes into play, and the comfort zone is essentially a force that just feeds into our own self-destructive stuff. And this comfort zone, I'd rather be comfortable. Which also leads us to another situation where people don't like confrontation and don't want to rock the boat, don't want to change the status quo. All that feeds into, so let's leave it as is. The fact that the status quo is not really a healthy one. The status quo is one where we're not really growing and we're not looking at ourselves and not looking at another person, but everybody's comfortable. This leads to what some people would call, what Thoreau calls, a life of quiet desperation. Most men lead a life of quiet desperation, with emphasis on the word quiet. There's desperation, you really feel desperate, you feel things aren't working. That's already a good thing, because at least you're uncomfortable. But quiet desperation is, you begin to resign yourself into your life situation where you say, you know what, this is who I am, this is who my spouse is, this is the other circumstances of my life. I don't know if you call yourself a victim of circumstances, but somewhat giving in, resigning to the fact that this is it. And the fact that I don't see clearly, or my significant other or close people around me don't see clearly, it's who wants to fight anymore? stick to the comfort zone. Now, I'm not here to make anybody uncomfortable, or actually I try to, but it doesn't always work. Like they say, you want to make miserable people happy and happy people miserable. Maybe that's not the right put it. Make comfortable people uncomfortable and uncomfortable people comfortable. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Because the fact of the matter is, yes, many people will live out their lives and not actualize their potential and not even realize how much they're missing and how much they don't see. There people will remain blind. Now, you really can't do anything much for somebody who just locks, digs in, and just refuses to see. Which is why I've told often people ask me, what happens if I'm dealing with someone, a therapist asks me, or a rabbi, I'm dealing with someone, they just don't see. What am I supposed to do? Wring their neck? So at some point you have to decide, you have to choose your battles and realize you can't really help someone that doesn't want to help themselves. But you can talk about it, like I'm doing right now. Because you never know. You never know when something will enter a person, even if they have living in this more delusional state where they don't even realize that they're blind to some things. They don't even know the unknown. They're not even aware of the unknown unknowns. And they don't even address that. But you never know. Something enters. Sometimes it's due to a crisis. Sometimes it's due to some wake-up call. But it's still important to talk about, because at the end of the day, I was taught and trained the firm belief that a person's soul is always there. Ani yashena, I may be asleep, but my heart is awake. So even though on one end we may be asleep, we may be walking in our sleep, meaning psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, we may not be fully cognizant at our fullest state of alert consciousness. And that could be a person who's basically completely overwhelmed with their work, overwhelmed with other material needs, and so on. And they neglect and forget about their deeper spiritual and transcendental and more and higher needs. But the soul is still ticking. The heart is still awake, even if on the outside they're asleep. So that's why we continue to talk, and we continue to stimulate and try to ignite something, because the soul is always awake, even for those that are completely blind. That's the ultimate good news. Now, it may take time to access, it may take many words, but words from the heart enter the heart. And if indeed there is that voice inside of us, and it's just a matter of continuing to being persistent and relentless, then it's worth it. Obviously, when it comes to dealing with people in time is limited, you can't deal with everybody. So you try to deal with those where you can be of help. And you try to deal with those that are open to something. I must say there are situations I've seen where people are just blinded, whether it's due to the mistakes they've made and they just can't come to terms and acknowledge it, or they're due to self-medicating and numbing themselves and not being able to therefore really look at things. That I see very often, which is a secondary problem, that it begins with an issue and then being that's so intolerable, they start numbing themselves. Self-medicating, whether it's with actual medication or with its psychological dependencies or other unhealthy and destructive behavior. And then you're talking to someone and dealing with someone, and you don't see where you can have an opening. So one has to make a decision. If a person is in that state, one makes a decision. The decision then is that perhaps, right at this point, I've told this to people. I said, as sad as it sounds, I really don't think I can help you anymore, because there's nothing getting through. Now you still know, I still have the hope. You still have the hope that there's someone there. But the question is, how much time can you spend? And maybe they need some more to go through their own lives before they get to that point. But that's more the logistics of it. But on a more conceptual level, there's no question that we have the capacity to both be blind, but we also have the capacity to be honest. And I always go back to my analogy with children. Children are not born liars. Children are not born duplicitous. Children are actually born, I would say they're pre-Simpson creations. They come from a reality that was seamless. There was no duality. And that's why in their early formative years, they are very seamless. It's only once they buy into and become part of and products of and are affected by the adults of our corrupt world, by the duplicities around them, that something changes. But that tells you something very powerful. We were all born children. We were all at some point pre-tree of knowledge consciousness, which meant the innocence that we had, where there was no two worlds, where there was only one reality, as we see it in young children. So the challenge is, can we re-access, can we reclaim that innocence? Can we regain that? Which is why you find that all human beings, even people who sometimes have gone to places that are very, very dark, there's a point in them, there's always a child in them that you could touch. You know, I saw some of the interviews, and this sounds maybe a little morbid, but some of the interviews with people, serial killers, who are behind bars, and they've been interviewed by journalists and by writers, you have to try to understand, how did a person become a serial killer? Or even maybe more grotesque, is people who are hired assassins. That's what they do. They're paid to kill. And you start listening to their lives. How did that happen? You know, the first time they murdered someone for $1,000 or whatever amount they got paid. And you try to go back to their childhood. Like, when did this person become a murderer? And I'm not talking about a murder, an act of passion. We're talking about deliberate, premeditated, hired gun. Right? A hired assassin. There are such people, unfortunately. And I've seen interviews with their parents. I mean, in most cases, you're going to find a very unhealthy childhood, obviously. It's not like some guy grew up healthy and just said, listen, I have option to become a doctor, a lawyer, or a physicist, and decide I'll become a hired assassin. It's usually not the way it works. They probably got into trouble, in most cases, younger. Maybe not murder, lesser crimes. But it always comes down to that at some point they got desensitized to the sanctity of life, and that life is valuable. And you could almost say that they're not just not valuing the people they kill, they don't even value their own life. There's a certain lack of sensitivity, which when you think about it, is so not natural to a human being, because naturally we're sensitive to our own lives for sure, and by natural to other people's lives. Yes, it is true that a person will be more protective over themselves than over others, and there are people who have informed on others, have hurt others, have even killed others, or have caused them to be killed. You know. However, everybody has a certain sensitivity, and it's not that simple to just murder somebody else. So when you think of it that way, when you start wondering, where did this sensitivity, the desensitization come into play? It's not from day one when they were born. Often it is to the hatred that they experienced in their own parents' homes, or to the broken family they grew up in, or, as I said, they saw life being treated like trash. So they developed an attitude that it's worthless. And once it's worthless, then of course, they allowed themselves to fall into places, to do things inappropriately, and then, as I said before, you wander off and suddenly, all you know, you're being called to kill somebody for money. So I'm not going to claim that I can understand going to the mind and the psychology of these individuals, but I will claim the following, that even people like that did not begin that way. People like that, that desensitization is not just blind spots. Their whole I would say even state of sanity, or their state of awareness, is completely distorted. And it's the only way for them to live. That they can't think of another person as a life. They have to just think it's my job, and that's that. So I just use this crazy example just to point out how distorted and blind the person can become. But going back to the roots of what I was saying earlier, it really comes down to the fact that we are individuals, are at essence, we're born with a certain sense of sanctity, and therefore a certain sense what I would call truth. And the truth and integrity is really seamlessness, a seamlessness. The best way to put it. And seamlessness is the opposite of concealment. When seamlessness means that everything is, like I mentioned before from the Eitz Chaim, that everything was filled with one reality, that is truth. The fact that we can have a truth that's concealed, the fact that it can go undercover, in the general sense or an individual sense, is a product and a symptom and consequence of the symptom that I described. But that's the first step. After that, it's up to us. So the first most important thing, and maybe that's exactly one of the great contributions that Arizal made by teaching us the symptom, is to know we live in a utterly concealed world, a world that does not reveal its source, an agnostic universe. The word in Hebrew for teva, for nature, teva in Hebrew is nature. It comes from a root, it means submerged. It comes from the verse tavu b'yamsuf. Tavu b'yamsuf, submerged in the sea. What does nature have to do with submergence? Because the way it's understood is very interestingly. When you look at nature, the sun rising, sun setting, the seasons, the natural order of the different species in this world, when you look at it, what do you see? You see beauty, you see harmony, you see design, you see tremendous symmetry. However, do you see the hand behind it? Do you see the choreographer or the conductor? It's like listening to music, but do you see who's playing this music? We don't. The example given often is that the world is like a gazan biyada chaytza, which means a axe in the hand of the axe holder, of the axe man. But imagine you only saw the axe and you don't see the one holding the axe. Or imagine seeing the glove without seeing the hand inside the glove. That means submerged. The divine architect, the energy and forces that shape existence are concealed. They're submerged, as if you threw an object into the sea, and where's the object? You don't see it. It's concealed. Even though it's definitely there. That you don't see the hand inside the glove. You don't see the force behind the action. So imagine seeing a stone flying right now, you know. So you'll deduce that the stone had to throw that stone. It didn't come from nowhere. Or some force had to propel that stone. But you don't see that force. All you see, the stone is moving. That's the universe in which we look at. We see a universe that works with more design, infinitely more design and wisdom than any clock, than any piece of technology, than any airplane, than any machine, than anything. But you don't see the engineer. You don't see the creator. So when it comes to a book, you read a brilliant piece of literature, you also don't see the author. But we right away recognize this author must be a great author to have written such a book. Same thing a piece of art. Same thing a piece of music. So that's why the way Chassidus puts it is that nature is called submerged because in nature is submerged the forces that make nature tick. That's the first example of a concealment. So we can delude ourselves into thinking, you know, it's the glove, it's not the hand. It's the axe, it's not the axe man. It's the object, not the one who's moving that object. And that's the first lie. Now, as I said earlier, that's a divine deception. God concealed. But when we buy into the lie, that's up to us. When we buy into it and say, you know what, that's all there is, what I see. All I know is what I see. Like someone tells me, I don't believe anything that I cannot count, meaning money. Now, every one of us knows that life, especially the most important elements of life, you cannot count. And you can't even see. You can't hear, taste, or touch, or smell it. Love, ideas, compassion, soulfulness, kindness, the things that make us tick, the things that make us human beings, that make us unique, are all invisible. Discussed it last week at length with technology. And yet, that remains concealed, so we only see the outer surface, like you see the sea, the ocean, and you have no clue what's underneath it. Today we know because cameras, people have dived under, and we know there's a whole universe there. More complex even than the universe that we know on Earth, on land. And that's what nature is. So it's a concealment, and the question is, do we buy into it or not? That's on a collective level, on a macrocosm. On the microcosm, it's the same with us. Self-interest is the way we were born, to protect ourselves, as I mentioned earlier. However, what happens next? If that self-interest and that self-serving focus, that egocentric focus goes too far, then suddenly what happens is I can do no wrong. Something goes wrong, someone else. Then you start buying into your own lies, into your own excuses, your own justifications. And to the point where the blind spots become no longer blind spots, they become part of your reality. No, I'm not blind. Something the matter with you. It's not me. And to the point where you completely lose sight, not only of the known unknowns, but also the unknown unknowns, as I discussed earlier. That's where you've gone off. So it began with, yes, we all are negei b'dov. We all are subjective creatures. We have our prejudices, we have our biases, we have our blind spots. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like existence began with a tzimtzum, there's a concealment. But don't overdo it. Keep it contained, minimized, which means that which is concealed because that's what God wants. That which is concealed because I am a subjective person, fine. But you counterbalance it, and that's the antidote by getting advice. I mean, almost normal people running a business are never going to just say, I'm going to make all the decisions by myself. They need an accountant, you need a lawyer, you need advisors, you talk to people who have more experience. Yeah, we make our mistakes, and sometimes we don't listen to them, and sometimes we don't consult. But everyone understands that there's certain things you're not going to just go buy a building or build a building of one story, let alone 20, 30 stories, without talking to someone who's built a building before. I mean, I don't think anybody would do that. We may cut corners, we may make our mistakes, because we understand that we don't know everything, and there's areas that we have no experience. I got to talk to someone that's more experienced. But that's easier because those areas don't touch us emotionally. There comes, you want to succeed in a business, or you want to build something, or you want to talk to someone that's done it before, obviously. But even there, frankly, many of us make subjective mistakes because we like to be right, or we don't like to hear that we're wrong. You could ask this to many accountants who tell you their clients are not interested in hearing all the mistakes they made, or at least couch it in a way that doesn't sound like they made such a bad mistake. But when it comes to our personal lives, that's where it gets out of control, because our personal lives is very emotional and very subjective, and that's where you are being so-called used under the microscope. It's no longer whether you made a right business decision and you want to make the best decision to succeed. Here, you're under the lights. You're so-called in judgment, meaning this reflects on your identity. And here's where it becomes more complicated because it really touches home, touches our hearts. So in a relationship, you're really ready to look at yourself, or you're going to look at someone else? And then, of course, it can spiral out of control, as I described, or you can nip it in the bud and stop the bleeding and do something about it by recognizing we have, yes, subjectivity. I'm not going to let my subjectivity become a monster that completely causes me to delude myself into thinking that I'm right when I'm wrong, or that my blind spots don't exist, or that I know which I don't know. And recognize that we have areas that we really need advice or guidance, and ready to accept that. Which, of course, is the concept of bittul, the ability to put yourself aside and do what's good. Do you know how many nights I've cried when I've seen how parents who biologically and naturally love their children with single-handedly are destroying their children, hurt their children? You think, how is that possible? You love your child more than anybody does. But because their self-righteousness and their self-delusion is so strong, they cannot see that maybe they don't know how to do it. Maybe they're making a mistake. No, that's not possible. I know what's right for my child. And often that's not the case. You love your child, I'm not questioning. But love doesn't always mean you know what's right. It means that you love them, and if you really love them, maybe you should check your own ego and check your own insecurity and maybe figure out maybe this is not the right thing for them. It's very hard for a parent who's insecure and obstinate and convinced that they know to hear that maybe they don't. just to show you how this blindness can ultimately cause damage. And I'm talking about damage, not just some subtle thing. Because the fact of the matter is, we all have our blind spots. We all have the place in our lives that we are not able to see, and especially the unknown unknowns. Can a person wake up? Absolutely. Because as I said before, even though nature conceals, and our own personal natures conceal us from our own truths, so Teva Odam also conceals Ava Mechasa, a Kol Davar. There you go. Love, self-love, covers everything. When you love someone, it covers up, you're ready to cover up their flaws. And you love yourself, Avas Atzmei, self-love can also covers up, conceals your own blind spots, your own weaknesses. The person acknowledges that, that's when begins the redemption. And here's the interesting and irony, that when you begin to really acknowledge and become aware that you don't know everything, and that there are known, you come to learn that there are unknowns, that you know that there are unknowns, and then you come to learn there are unknown unknowns. You know what happens? You suddenly begin to master the unknown, because you've allowed yourself to acknowledge that. That's how it opens up to you, and that's when you start discovering. Either you come to know the unknown, the unknowable, or at least you come to extrapolate what it's like. But as long as you're convinced, so think of somebody standing on the ground, on a plateau, and you ask them, what does the horizon look like? And they give you an image, but they look up and they see the sky, they see the sun, they see this. This is what it looks like. Now ask them to climb up on a mountain 20 feet up. They climb up, what do you see now? They'll give you a different answer, because they see more. Go to the top of the mountain, the peak of the mountain, what do you see now? A completely different picture, because they're no longer on the ground. It's like a bird's eye view. The horizon is completely different. And you say, okay, so which one is the right one? The truth is really, depends on your perspective, but the right one is obviously the highest peak. But imagine a person is convinced that they're already on the peak. They're convinced that where I am right now, that's all there is. There's nothing higher than me. There's no climbing. They can live their lives and convince themselves that the horizon is not at all what it really is. It's someone looking with myopic vision from middle through their tunnel vision or myopic vision and see a little picture and they think that's it. As soon as you acknowledge and say, you know what, I don't know if there's a peak or not. I can only tell you what I see, but it's very possible there's a whole different way to look at it. As soon as you say that and truly acknowledge it, you're already on your way to being able to see a broader horizon. So the irony is that the more locked into your and the more locked in you are to your position, the less likely that you'll ever see anything outside of your eyes, from your higher than your perspective. The less you're locked into your position, the more open you are that maybe possible there's another way to look at it. Then what happens is that itself opens you up to the possibilities of a higher reality. You may not immediately know the unknowns or the unknown unknowns, but at least you're going in that direction. And there's a point you will come, if you consistently are that honest, you're able to say there may be another way to look at it, that you ultimately do come to really reach the unknown unknowns. And then maybe new horizons open up, new unknowns, but you're always embracing the mystery. You are comfortable with the fact that you don't know it all. In the words of the Ikrim, Tachlis hayediyah shaloi neda. The ultimate of knowing is knowing that you don't know. And that can be interpreted two ways, that the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know, the more you realize how much more there is to know. Or you could say the ultimate knowing is knowing the unknowable, which is of course a deeper interpretation. Because as soon as you come to that type of bittul, that type of humility, you're able to say that alone opens you up to know the unknowable. Because you're embracing something that's beyond yourself. As long as you think you have it figured out, so you'll know, what you don't know, you don't know. As soon as you say, 1 second, there's a part of I don't know, I'm not there yet, but I'd like to be there, you have already become a container, a conduit to be able to experience the unknowable. And those are the people that really achieve excellence, that achieve true growth. Because what happens is they're able to use their humility and their bittul and their ability to step back to allow them to really embrace something much greater. In relationships and marriage, this is a key, is to embrace the mystery, not to think you can be in control. Everybody wants to be in control. Now, control is a result of, frankly, insecurity. You need to control it. The people who don't need control, you know what? Maybe there's a mystery here. Maybe I should let it control me. Let events take their power. Is a certain surrender in a good way, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Celebrating your vulnerability is what allows you to experience the mystique. There's a mystique. And who says you have to have it all figured out? And who says you have to have it all under your control? And that's when you become truly a great person, because then you embrace it all. That which is knowable, that which is unknowable. And you can even smile and say, you know what? There's something beautiful about knowing that I don't know everything. There's something beautiful about knowing that there's a mystery that's beyond me. And as I said, ironically, that's what leads you to actually being able to experience it. Like it says about kavod, about honor, that kol haberech achar kavod. Anyone who pursues honor, kavod berech b'menu, the honor eludes them, runs away from them. But anyone that runs away from honor, the honor pursues them. Because honor is not something you can own, you can't control it. It's something that emerges. People honor you. You can't buy that. You can't own it, you can't control it. As some comment, running away from honor doesn't mean running and looking over your shoulder if it's pursuing you. It actually means that you're humble enough that you're not looking for the honor. And that's when it comes your way. All greatness comes that way. Anyone trying to find that type of, trying to enter into the unknowable world of the unknowable realities, and they want it too much, they will not be able to have it. As Moses, what did God tell him when he said, Hareina es kvedecha, show me, God, Moses says to God, show me your glory, show me your face, your essence. And God says, Lo yireini adam v'chay, no person can see me and live. What was he saying? He's saying, you want it, then it's on your terms, it's not me. You want me, you can't want it. You have to wait, you have to be humble, and it will emerge. If you want something on your terms, you'll get it on your terms, but it's not going to be me. You want really an experience, that's even God. You want to experience another person, sometimes you have to just let go, and you'll experience it. If you try to own it, you try to control it, you try to understand it, analyze it, evaluate it, that is its undoing. Yeah, you may get somewhere, but you're not going to get the essence of it. You'll get expression, you'll get an expression that you can relate to, that speaks to you. And that's the ultimate beauty of life, is when you're able to embrace the essence of things. And the essence of things are, by definition, not containable. They defy our capacity to own and control. Now, we live in a world of acquisitions. We live in a world of ownership. We live in a world of people wanting to control things. Well, that's very good for materialism. In the material world, that's how transactions are made. In spirituality, there's no such thing as ownership. You don't own anything. You don't own your soul. You don't own someone else's soul. You don't own love, and you can't buy it, and you can't sell it. And the same thing with other ethereal and more sublime forces in our lives. What you do is you humbly accept it, and then it becomes part of who you are. So it's essentially recognizing that there are realities that are beyond us, and the realities that we want to own. Ownership is in a very superficial and surface level, and that goes back to the things that you know and that you can control. But the unknowable, and basically these places that most of us have blind spots, you can only get beyond that is if you recognize that's what you that's not about your control. It's not about your understanding and how you see things. So, my friends, in that context, the anatomy of self-sabotage. Self-sabotage is based on our ability to, our capacity to buy into the illusion, the delusion of the reality of this world's lies, including its concealment, and being able to become someone that just is blind to their own blind spots and blind to the things they can't see. And the antidote to that is to recognize that's not the case. Now, how do you begin? You begin by being honest. You begin by really wanting greatness. You want truth. If your comfort zone is so powerful and your status quo is so compelling, it's hard to imagine how you're going to be shaken out of that. So I hope we could all shake ourselves or help each other shake ourselves out of our reverie and our sleep. But always know that even though you're asleep, I'm asleep, the heart is awake. So you could look at it this way. The Meaningful Life Center, myself included, and our team, we're here to help access the part that's awake. It's awake beneath the surface. Remember, the outer levels can be in a slumber. And try to uru yeshenim mitar damaschem, to wake up the sleepers, the people asleep from their slumber, and hopefully be able to see and hear realities that are a little greater and higher than what we're usually accustomed to. And the best way is to not allow yourself to get trapped in the rat race, in the rush hour, in the 90-mile-an-hour rat race of our lives, the merry-go-round, the roller coaster, whatever analogy you want to use, and to step back. In the morning you wake up, that's why we have time for a little short prayer, longer prayer to study. Step back, look at your life a little objectively, as if you're looking at it from the outside, like a little bird's eye view of your life. Not let yourself become trapped in the minutia and the forces that hold us hostage. And when you do that, you're able to start seeing broader horizons. And please see us, the Meaningful Life Center, myself, as allies. We're partners in this journey, in this spiritual journey, as they say, not physical beings having a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having a physical experience. So every Wednesday, 8:15, 8:30, we begin. Those of you, wherever you may be, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or all the other channels, please stay in touch, comment, ask questions, and let's create a revolution of higher consciousness, a revolution, an awakening to get out of the slumber and see the realities of the world as they are, and see ourselves as we truly can be. And always good to have a very good friend and a good mentor that can help you see sometimes things you may not be able to see, including your blind spots. And we all need that, and we all help each other that way. So everybody have a very enlightening week, an eye-opening week. And until next Wednesday, this has been Simon Jacobson. God bless you all. Okay.